Now, during the last two sessions, I told the story of how Hanukkah emerged. Right? And now I want to turn to the connection between Hanukkah and Christmas. One of the things you may remember that I want you to hold on to is the story of the holiday that is very, very old, which lies behind Hanukkah and Christmas. And that's a holiday that celebrates a very important time in the year when darkness seems to overtake the world, and then all of a sudden, or not so suddenly, the light is reborn. It's called the winter solstice. And in fact, the Maccabees chose the winter solstice as the time to celebrate their great victory, as they perceived it, over the Greeks, and thus Hanukkah was born. Hanukkah being a second name for a very old holiday that celebrated the winter solstice among the Jewish people. The name of that holiday was Nerot, the Feast of Lights, and the word Hanukkah means dedication, the rededication of the temple. Now, Christmas also has its roots in that celebration, only it emerged out of a slightly different historical context, which was to follow the Hanukkah story. And the Hanukkah story and the Christmas story are intimately connected because they're tied to a particular time in history and with a particular historical development in which the Jewish people was the center, but in which the setting was the Greek and Roman world. And we started out this series by talking about the relationship between the Jews and the Greeks. So now let me take you back to 100 BC, all right? That's about 2,100 years ago. 100 BC, and we're going to look at three nations who are part of the story that I want to tell this evening. The first are the Jews, all right? 100 BC, the Jews. Right. At that time, the Jews were an independent nation. In 100 BC, what today we call Israel, which at that time was called Judea, was an independent nation. It had not been independent for 400 years. It had been conquered by Chaldeans, by Persians, and by Greeks. And it had achieved its independence somewhere around the year 140 BC. But it had been independent for some 40 years, and during that period of time, it had expanded its territory. And its territory corresponded roughly to most of what today is the state of Israel. Right? Secondly, this independent country was ruled by a royal family that used three titles. One was taken from the Greek, and after all, Greek culture was pervasive. It was ethnarchos, ethnarch. The word ethnic is related to it. Ruler of the nation. They were also the chief religious official of the nation, and therefore they were called the high priest. And they were also, and they chose this title somewhere around 104 BC, just 4 years before I'm telling the story. And that title, which was very provocative, was the title of king. So they had three titles. They were the ruling family, and the Maccabees had been pretty much in charge of the Jewish people for the past 60 years. And they were the leaders of the Jews in achieving independence from the Greek world. Judea, or Israel, had a state religion. It was a religion supported by the state and which in many cases was imposed on all the people who resided within the state. That religion was built around two things: a building called the temple, which was in Jerusalem, which was the only legitimate temple of the state religion. And it was built around a god. That God, who was the God believed to be resident in that temple as well as up in heaven, that God had a name. His name was Yahweh, and he was viewed by the Jews as the one and only God. If indeed there were other supernatural figures around, either benign or malignant, they were so inferior in power they could not even be called gods. And attendant on the temple and on the God was a priesthood. A priesthood which claimed to be descended from a single person, Aaron, who was supposedly the brother of a man, a famous leader of the past called Moses. And entry into that priesthood was only through birth. You could not sign up for the program, all right? I mean, you were either born into it or you were not there. Now, it also features something very interesting, a diaspora, going all the way back to the 6th century BC, to 597 BC. Jews had either been taken away as captives or had voluntarily left the area. And now they lived in large communities outside. It is estimated that around 100 BC there may have been over 2 million or 2.5 million Jews resident in Judea itself. So it was well populated. And it is estimated that an equal number of Jews lived outside the country. They lived in two places. Half of them lived in what today is Iraq. At that time it would have been called either Chaldea or Babylonia. And the Greek name for the place was the place between the rivers. It was called Mesopotamia. And the second place was right near Judea or Israel, still there. It's called Egypt, which at that time was certainly governed by a Greek dynasty, the chief city of which was Alexandria. Now, under the Maccabees, the territory of Judea tripled and quadrupled in size. Before the Maccabees had arrived, this family, the area of Judea was nothing more than suburban Jerusalem. But during the reign of the Maccabees, for over 60 years, the territory had tripled, and in fact the Maccabees had added new territories in which the inhabitants had been forcibly converted to the state religion. One of the new areas was Galilee, and certainly one of the new areas was a place to the south of Jerusalem, a place that was called Idumea or Edom or the land of the Edomites. Now there was within Judea a tension which defines the story, goes all the way to the beginning. It has to do with the arrival of this most powerful culture into the life of the Jews. It's called Greek culture. And very early the Jewish people divided between those who liked it and those who hated it. In the time of the Maccabees, the division was somewhat the same, but with a slight variation. There were those people whom we would call nationalists. They were interested in increasing the power and strength of the independent Jewish state. And they were on the whole Hellenists, including, strangely enough, the Maccabees. That isn't how the Maccabees began, but that's how they ended up. Because you had to be. In order to make Judea strong, she would have to be open to the culture and technology that the Greeks themselves brought. So if you didn't want to Hellenize, you would consign your state to weakness. It's very much like today. You may hate America, but if you want to repudiate American technology, you're not going to be able to develop a decent economy or a decent weaponry. So that's the irony. And so the nationalists were on the whole the successors to the Hellenists. And ironically, the Maccabee family, which had rebelled against the Greeks, became the champions of Hellenization because they needed that technology in order to keep the country independent. Now, opposed to them were the anti-Hellenists. They were the people who had initially supported the Maccabees and now came to hate them because they felt betrayed. Their agenda was religion. They believed there was no need for an independent Jewish state. All they wanted was the freedom to practice their religion as they saw fit. They had no interest in independence because, as far as they were concerned, a figure was going to be arriving very soon, sent by Yahweh, sent by God. His name was the Messiah. And when he arrived, he would overthrow all existing governments, all existing boundaries, establish Jerusalem as his capital on earth, and then usher in the final judgment day when the dead would rise from their graves and God would descend from heaven. So who cares about a boundary? They were preparing for the Messiah. So all this politics about boundaries and armies and all of that was absolutely irrelevant, and they regarded it as blasphemous. So they felt betrayed by the Maccabees. The Maccabees had initially been the leaders of this group. And then when they achieved religious freedom for them, for themselves, this group said, well, that's it. But the Maccabees said, no, we want a strong, independent state. And so they went on ahead. And in so doing, they shifted from one side to the other. So there was a tension, a built-in tension within Israel, within Judea itself. Now let me turn to the people who had conquered the Jews and from whom the Jews had achieved independence somewhere around 160 BC. They're a very important part of this story because you can't understand Christianity if you only talk about the Jews. You can't understand Christmas if you only talk about the Jews. Very important in this story are the Greeks. And it is out of the encounter between Jews and Greeks that both Hanukkah and Christmas arrive. So you only want to talk about Jews, you're not going to be able to understand either holiday. And now we're moving on toward the story of Christmas. In 100 BC, where were the Greeks? Well, the great empire of Alexander was beginning to disappear. On the one hand, the Greeks were culturally very successful. Their culture had spread all over Western Asia. In fact, it had reached the boundaries of India. The Greek language, Greek technology, Greek cities, all of it had reached the boundaries of India, and in fact, they had moved all the way through the Mediterranean, all the way to the Straits of Gibraltar. So culturally, they were very, very successful, but politically, by 100 BC, they were far less successful. There were three enemies who now arrived to assault the political power of the Greeks. The first were a people coming from the east called the Parthians. They lived in what today is northeastern Iran or Persia. They had been conquered by the Greeks, and now they rose up and used Greek technology to assault the Greeks. And they pushed the Greeks all the way back to the coast, to the Mediterranean coast. One of the reasons why the Jews were able to achieve independence from the Greeks was because the Greeks were so busy what? Fighting the Parthians and not winning. The second was the rise in the 1st century BC of a powerful people who hadn't been on the political scene before. They lived in what today is eastern Turkey, and they're called the Armenians. And in the 1st century BC, one of their leaders, a man by the name of Tigran, later on in Greek known as Tigranes, or in English Tigranes, now arose, and the Armenians now began to press against the Greek states and grew in size. And the third was a people that came from Italy, a people which had started in a small section of central Italy around a short river called the Tiber. They were called the Romans, and in fact the Romans had conquered almost the entire western Mediterranean and were now moving eastward against the Greeks. So, although the culture was very powerful, the Greeks themselves were losing their political independence. The only place in the Greek world where things seemed to be holding steady was ironically not in Greece proper itself, but in Egypt. Egypt was the most stable of all the Greek states, and in fact it was to be the last of the Greek states to surrender its independence. So let me turn to the people who basically now took over the Greek world. The Parthians took over part of it. The Armenians for a short time took over part of it. But the people who were ultimately to take over most of it, and who were now to enter into the story in the 1st century BC, were the Romans. So let me try to describe the Romans and distinguish them from the Greeks. When the Romans first emerged, their culture was quite different from what it became. Today, when we think of Roman culture, we often think of Greek architecture and Greek sculpture, because the Romans swallowed Greek culture almost whole. That is, the Greeks did to the Romans, in fact, a far more powerful act than they did to the Jews. So the original Roman culture is almost what? Invisible. You can't even see it, because the Romans loved Greek culture so much they just what? Swallowed it whole. So today we don't speak of it as Roman, we speak of Greco. You always say it, they all go together with a hyphen. Greco-Roman culture. Now, when the Romans started out, they were a tribe, if you will, of a small group of people in central Italy called Latins. And the people who were Latins spoke a language that many of us were either forced to study or chose to study in the 9th, 10th, 11th, or 12th grade, called Latin. All right. And the Latins were part of a larger group of people that we call the Italian peoples. The other Italian peoples have disappeared because they were all conquered by the Latins and by the Romans. And the center of the Roman tribe was a city called Roma, or Rome, not particularly big or distinguished from the other places. Nobody would predict, certainly in the 6th century BC, that this little city-state would rise up to conquer the world. But it did. And the question, of course, is how? I mean, the Romans were surrounded by very powerful enemies. To the north of them were a people that had been driven out by the Greeks from Asia Minor, from where Turkey is today, and had come to live on the coast of Italy. Their name was the Etruscans. And in fact, they had a very powerful culture and a powerful technology, related in many cases to the Greek technology and culture, and they had come to live in the area. They've left their name there. We now refer to the area north of Rome as Tuscany, and that comes from the Etruscans. And then, in the north, coming out of Central Europe, were very powerful people who became the ancestors of the Irish and the Scots and so forth, and the Gauls. They're called the Celts. And they occupied almost all of Central Europe, and they crossed the Alps and came down into the valley of the Po and then headed southward. And the Celts were very powerful, very strong, warlike people. And the third was the arrival in southern Italy of a people called the Greeks. They established colonies there. I mean, like many of the cities that we think are Italian have Greek names. Napoli, what could be more Italian? Naples. Well, that's a Greek word, Neapolis, the new city. And all the cities of southern Italy and a large part of Sicily were basically what? Greek cities established there by the Greeks, who now brought the Greek culture. The first contact of the Romans with the Greeks was in southern Italy. And the name for southern Italy among the Romans was Greece. That's how these people who call themselves the Hellenes came to be called in Latin the Greeks. So there they are, all squeezed among these three, and how they broke out, was an amazing story. And the reason they did, and I have to describe how they did. When the Greeks started out, they were essentially warriors. But as Greek cities developed, they moved from war, they still produced a lot of warriors, to business. That's how they became rich. And that's how they developed their culture on the foundation of a rising middle class. But Rome, from the very beginning, produced warriors. The whole system of government of Rome was built around war. So it was a little state built around the making of war. Every male was recruited into the Roman army. And if you disobeyed your commander or you deserted, and they caught you, the penalty was always death. So the Roman army became the foundation of Roman culture. And there was no greater virtue than military virtue. And the government of the state was organized around the producing of the army. It was the great military mood of this little state that ultimately produced the conquest, because they were organized differently from the other Latin states, which they then went out to conquer, and then they took whatever military structure they had, and then whammoed the Celts and whammoed the Etruscans, and then whammoed the Greeks of southern Italy. And by the 3rd century BC, they had conquered and unified all of Italy. Along the way, they developed a government. The government initially was built around a series of assemblies composed of soldiers. Oh. In order to vote significantly, you had to be a soldier, and the way soldiers were rewarded was by the gift of land. So many of the chief soldiers became the big landowners. As they moved forward conquering, they would divvy out the land. They would often create Roman colonies where they would put little groups of veterans, got it, right there with military training to control the area. And the Roman system was very powerful, and it worked. Ultimately, the government that emerged was the government by elders. These were the descendants of old warriors who had gotten the first land. They're called patricians. And the patricians were organized into a ruling body that we call the Senate. As I pointed out in previous lectures, the word Senate, which means the body of elders, is related to the word senile. All right, they go together, but I mean the point was they were governed by this body. They were not governed by a king. Now they did have what we call military rulers. The initial role of their chief magistrate, who was elected every year, the consul, was to lead people in war. And if there was a serious war, the people could elect what was called a dictator, a dictator, who would then be the commander-in-chief to make sure that everything went right. So if you want to understand Rome, it differed from Greece in the sense that at the heart of its culture was the army and the organization of the army, and the Roman legion as it emerged was extraordinarily powerful. Once they conquered all of Italy, by the 3rd century BC, they went after the Western Mediterranean. Now you have to understand a warrior culture. It's like a business culture. If at the heart of your culture there's business, you have to go out and conquer more and more markets, right? That's the heart of a business culture. You're never satisfied. There's a market over there and a market over there and a market over here. But if you are a warrior culture, then you have to keep making war, otherwise you will disemploy the people who are in charge. That is the heart of a warrior culture. So it just keeps moving on from conquest to conquest. Now the great enemy for the Romans in the Western Mediterranean was a people related to the Jews. They spoke the same language as the Jews. They spoke Hebrew. They were back in their homeland called Canaanites. And they were known to the Greeks as the people who made the purple dye, Phoenicians. And so the Phoenicians or the Canaanites became a commercial people, and they traversed the Mediterranean and they established bases over here, and their greatest colony was on the coast of North Africa in what today is Tunisia, where they created a city called Karta Hadasha, which means in Canaanite or Hebrew, the new city. It meant the new Phoenicia. And in fact, Carthage, as we call it in English, became even more powerful than most of the cities back in the homeland. And the Carthaginians controlled the trade in the Western Mediterranean. In order for the Romans to take the Western Mediterranean, they would have to defeat the Carthaginians, which they then proceeded to do. Over a period of a century and a half, they defeated the Carthaginians and took from the Carthaginians Sicily, Corsica and Sardinia, all of Spain and Portugal with all its wealth, in particular of metals, and North Africa. And they became the master, certainly by the beginning of the 2nd century BC, around the time when the Maccabees emerged. They became the master of the entire Western Mediterranean, but this war machine couldn't what? It couldn't stop. It just kept going. Well, having won their victory in the Western Mediterranean, the war machine now turned to the Eastern Mediterranean where the Greeks were. And they fought a series of battles. Some of them I referred to last time, because the great Greek king they had to fight was a man by the name of Antiochus. First, they crossed over to where today there is Greece and Macedonia, and they defeated the armies of the Macedonians and the Greeks who were resident in what today is Greece. And then they crossed over to Asia, what today is called Turkey, or Asia Minor, and there at the famous battle of, you may have remembered the famous battle of Magnesia. Remember the battle of Magnesia? They defeated the Greek king, and now they were on a roll. They had penetrated into the Greek kingdoms of Asia, and now the Greek empire began to what? Shrink, assaulted by the Parthians and now by the Romans. That was one of the reasons why the Jews were able to achieve their independence. The Greeks were diverted by the Parthians and by the Romans. The Romans were now on a roll. Along the way, they established Roman military colonies all over the place with Roman military veterans. But now I have to tell you the most important thing that happened. Once they conquered southern Italy and the Greek cities, They fell in love with Greek culture. And within a matter of 150 to 200 years, while the military structure remained the same, the daily culture of the people became almost indistinguishable from that of the Greeks. Greek architecture, Greek sculpture, Greek sports, all of it took over the Roman world. All they did was change the names from Greek to Latin. But if you look at Latin, you will see often that 50 to 60% of all the words that are used in philosophy and what we would call higher learning come from Greek. They actually come from Greek. If I say the word philosophia, you know, in Latin, it's what? Or philosophia, it's what? It's from Greek. It's a Greek word that came into Latin. And and in fact, the Latin alphabet itself derives from the Greek alphabet with adjustments. All of a sudden, they swallowed it whole. So interestingly enough, the Romans, although they conquered the Greeks, were in turn conquered by Greek culture. So wherever they went, they now became the purveyors of Greek culture. In fact, they adjusted all their gods to the Greeks. So you can whenever you take a little mythology, they always say, well, Zeus, that's what? That's Jupiter. Well, Hera, that's Juno. I mean, you can compare the two. They all fit into each other. Ultimately, the Romans themselves adjusted their god list, their religion, to the Greeks. It was a very, very overwhelmingly powerful change. Again, a tribute to the power of Greek culture, which is at the center and at the heart, certainly, of the tension in our story. Now, as the Roman Republic expanded and expanded and expanded, it ran into problems. It was like Detroit. Detroit's great problem, which it doesn't have anymore. But let me try to describe it. In the teens and 20s of this century, Detroit went from 250,000 people to 1.5 million. You got that? In a very short period of time. So it grew like topsy. People didn't know what was happening. Thousands of people poured into the city. I mean, real estate values soared. And the city government, the amenities, all of it were inadequate for dealing with the growth. That's why Detroit's downtown never grew properly, because it was always too small for the size of the city. It just grew too fast. Well, the same thing was happening here. It was growing too fast for the government to adjust. There were all these challenges to this rapid growth of the Roman Empire. And in fact, those challenges came to a head right at this time. So now let me try to describe the challenges. The first was the aristocracy. The aristocracy that ruled Rome in the Senate were a bunch of landowners who were descended from the original successful warriors. Now, they were fine for governing a city or maybe a small county. They were not suitable. The style of government was not suitable to the government of an expanding empire. It was just basically inefficient, inappropriate. These people sitting in the Senate didn't have enough information or know-how for governing this expanding empire. And not only that, there was great resentment against them, because now many of them no longer went to war themselves, but sent the conscripted sons of the poor out to fight the war. And so Rome experienced in the 2nd and 1st century BC a whole series of rebellions against the aristocracy. It was just inevitable. It was just growing too fast. The second problem, obviously, was the government. The Roman government pretended that it was only the government of a city-state. In order to vote in a Roman election, you had to be a citizen of the city of Rome. But what if you lived in Spain? What if you lived in North Africa? No accommodation, because it had started out as a what? As a city-state. So this whole government, the whole structure of this government was absolutely absurd, because in order to vote you'd have to show up in Rome itself, but that may have been hundreds of miles away. One of the problems was the military. It happens to the military. The military was very successful. So you can hear the generals already. Who are these idiots in the Senate who are making all these decisions when we're out on the field what? Doing all the hard work. We know what's going on. So in the end, one of the great challenges was the rising power of the army and the generals in the army, whether they're going to be called Julius Caesar or General Pompey. They were simply saying, we don't have enough recognition, we don't have enough power. One of the great problems was that the Romans conquered dozens of nations, speaking different languages. Now, trying to digest many nations, we know that in America, right? It was called immigrants. You bring them in and you try to what? You try to digest them. So digesting all these people was not easy. What status do you give them? Do you say, well, people only of Roman descent can vote in the assemblies? Do you wish to draft these minorities into your army? And if you draft them into your army, do you want to let them be officers? Oh, well. After all, they may not be Roman patriots. So this was a continuing problem. One of the major problems, which relates to the origin of Christmas, is that the Roman religion now became inadequate. The Roman religion was built around a city-state. But now religion was changing because the Romans had created a political reality that was very, very different from what Rome was when it started out as an itsy-bitsy little city-state. So let me try to point out what it was. The first thing was that the Romans had abandoned their old culture and had now accepted Greek culture. So the first great challenge was to adjust their religion to Greek culture and the Greek world, and they did that by basically finding equivalence in Roman pantheons to Greek gods. One of the major problems was that as the Roman Empire expanded and people began to move freely over wide areas, cities began to grow. And the cities became large, including Rome, and now the city was filled not only with Romans, but with a mixed population. And each of these nations had their own national gods. Now, if you want to produce a sense of unity in your empire, you can't do that if you have 100 different national religions represented in the urban population. One of the great needs was to find a religion that somehow or other could what? Transcend all this difference. One of the problems was as you urbanized people and they became separated from their clan and their tribe, they developed the beginnings of what we call individualism or individuality. And once you begin to say I instead of we, it takes a while in civilization for people to reach I. They all start out with what? With we, because you start out with a clan, a tribe, a family, the we, and you're struggling for survival. Finally, you get to the urbanization, and you're beginning to say I. Once you say I, then the level of your expectation rises. When you're only in we, you're willing to sacrifice yourself for the sake of we. But when you're into I, then all of a sudden you're into, well, I want, I need, I'm not happy, I want to be happy. Got the I? All right. We have a lot of it in America today. It's what happens with affluence and individualism. And now people were no longer satisfied with the old religion, because the old religion basically said, well, if you need shelter, ask the gods for it. Fine. Hey, I need shelter. Okay. Or if you want to get rid of your boils, ask the what? The gods for it. But as you raise the level of expectation, people want more. One of the things that people now wanted, as the level of expectation rose in urban civilization, was not simply shelter and food. They wanted to be like the gods. They wanted to live forever. Oh. They wanted ultimately now to get rid of a life of pain and suffering and death. Oh. One of the problems of affluent cultures, you have it in America, is that you raise the level of expectation to the point where you finally think you've satisfied them, and what? No. The expectation level just what? Keeps rising and rising. It's endless. People want now to be the gods themselves. So, and that was happening in religion. One of the big issues, you see, was authority. As you have an expanding empire, people now become interested in authority, administration, and law and order. And the sign of law and order is that the wicked are punished and the good are rewarded. And before, you might not have that expectation of the gods, but now what? That's what you want. Well, if it's true